In this video, we're going to take a brief look here at the discipline known as rhetorical criticism. So several things here to think about. First of all, one is what is rhetorical criticism and how does it differ particularly from redaction criticism? While redaction criticism critics examine what distinctive elements are within each gospel unit and how they might point to the author's intention, rhetorical critics are examining how the distinctive structure of a gospel overall, paralleled with ancient rhetorical devices, might point to the author's intention. So both are seeking to find out or discover what the author thought he was trying to communicate, but they're taking kind of different tactics. So with redaction criticism, yes, you're looking at gospel units, and they might be able to bring all those different units, different distinctive elements in each unit, all kind of together to describe a author's intention. But rhetorical criticism is particularly attuned to the instructions that were given in ancient times about rhetoric. So rhetoric was kind of a staple of education, particularly for young Greek men. And so there were actually handbooks that were written to kind of guide, rhetorical abilities. And so because of the existence of these handbooks and this kind of recognition of techniques that existed, rhetorical critics are asking the question, how do our authors, might they've been influenced by those rhetorical techniques when they were composing the Gospels? So some examples of early rhetorical criticism, on things that they note. Well, for instance, the we sections of Acts, and what they would do with those sections is compare them to accounts of ancient Mediterranean sea voyages. So when people accounted for those voyages, what did they do, and how are these we sections in Acts similar to what is done in those other accounts? Teaching learning cycles in Mark. So when we see Mark kind of having Jesus in these kind of teaching moments, compare those to ancient Greek, so like Plato's and Philostratus, or Israelite or Hellenistic and rabbinic teaching learning cycles. So just trying to see, if there's a pattern here for how these teaching learning cycles would occur in these different materials. And how do our Gospels, in particular like Mark here, follow that? One example of an early rhetorical critic is Vernon Robbins' Jesus the Teacher, 1992. And so you can even think about Jesus as a teacher and Jesus's rhetorical style, not just the Gospels themselves. Another popular method was advocated by George Kennedy's five-step method. And so I'm just going to lay out those 5 steps here and as this one methodology for doing rhetorical criticism. So first of all, you have to determine the different rhetorical units that exist, and there are several units. And so you would want to answer why the author wrote, who he wrote to, who the intended audience seems to be, and the constraints that may have been placed on what he has to say. So in other words, because of the relationship that he has with them, or doesn't have with them, there may be certain constraints on him in terms of what he does. So for instance, this rhetorical criticism is quite popular even in the Pauline literature. So if you think about Paul's relationship with the Philippians, who he knows, as opposed to Paul's letter to the Romans, whom he generally does not know. He hasn't been to Rome. And so are there different constraints or lack of constraints on how they organize their materials to persuade or to introduce their readers to different topics, to take them through their thoughts, to lead them to a certain conclusions? determine the species of rhetoric that would be used. And so there are different classifications of rhetorics. And so Kennedy would lay out what these different species are and then try to categorize different rhetorical attempts with these different species. So, for instance, you might have a judicial species. So that's where the author is trying to accuse or defend someone. You might have a deliberative rhetorical style, that is to persuade or dissuade from a particular course of action. Of course, in judicial, you're still trying to persuade or dissuade, but in the judicial, it has this kind of more case-orientated legal case scenario. And then you have epidetic, and this is primarily to praise or to blame. So, with the Gospels, you could think about the Gospels in either one of these species, or maybe even a combination of these species. There may be times in which the author is attempting to have Jesus material used to accuse opponents of the Christian community behind the gospel, or to defend the Christian community against accusations made by opponents. Or how is this material in the Gospels intending to persuade the community to stay faithful to um, to what they have been taught about Christ and following Christ and living as disciples of Christ, or dissuade them from other alternative visions of Christ that may have existed. Certainly, the material wants to praise Jesus. So, how do they arrange materials so that the reader might come to want to praise Jesus for different kind of characteristics and virtues that he emulates, or maybe to blame someone who is either in the narrative itself or standing behind the community. A fourth one is to analyze the different inventions, arrangements, and styles. And so these terms here, exordium, narratio, partitio, probatio, rufatio, and peroratio, these are different aspects of the rhetorical style that were popular at the time, and that there were different goals within each section of this. And so if a letter, for instance, for Paul's letters, how might it follow this kind of format? Or for Gospels, how might it follow these formats? So what information does the author use to argue his point, is what you would be analyzing, and how does the author arrange his information in some kind of rhetorical fashion? What characterizes this author's unique style? Again, so kind of comparing what Mark does and Matthew does and Luke does. So, for instance, everybody kind of knows or recognizes that Matthew arranges his materials in a very unique way around these 5 discourses. So what's happening there when he does that? And is that following a certain way of persuading his audience to a certain view about Jesus? It's also recognized in Luke's gospel that Luke has a section that ends in Luke chapter 9 and takes you all the way up through Luke 18. It's this kind of travel narrative. And so what's going on with this travel narrative where Jesus is headed towards Jerusalem, and this is where discipling takes place. So trying to see some of these unique styles of the authors and how their kind of arrangements fit into what is known as these other styles or other aspects of rhetorical arrangements. And so finally is just to evaluate the rhetorical effectiveness, whether or not we think, of course we can't talk to the recipients of this to know whether or not they were persuaded. You might be able to, if you have a letter, say like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, if you got 1st Corinthians that were written and then you have 2nd Corinthians, Paul is responding to how they may have responded to 1st Corinthians, well then you might be able to indicate, at least from Paul's perspective, whether or not his first letter was effective. But generally, we don't have knowledge of how effective these rhetorical styles would have been. But what we're measuring is, or what a rhetorical critic would be measuring is, how likely is this style to be effective, considering the ways in which rhetorical devices were used at the time, and whether or not our New Testament authors are as sophisticated or as polished in their rhetorical styles as what some of the other more classic pieces are. So generally in rhetorical criticism, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to think about how these authors may have been influenced by the rhetorical interest that existed at that time, and seeing how much of their material does follow an arrangement that would have been known at that time, and how consistent it would, or how much does it break, from those styles. So that's generally the contribution for rhetorical criticism.